Good afternoon. My name is John Strope. I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag History Lecture Series. Lectures are held monthly on the third Thursday in the auditorium at the Nebraska History Museum at 15th and P Street in Lincoln. The programs have a live audience, are taped by City TV 5, are broadcast on government access channels in Lincoln, Omaha, Bellevue, Hastings, North Platte, Grand Island, Papillion, South Sioux City, and Beatrice, and are posted on YouTube. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all of the Society's programs and services, can be found on the Society's website at www.nebraskahistory.org. If you are not already a member, I encourage you to join. Benefits of membership include subscriptions to Nebraska History Magazine and to the Society's newsletter, use of a microfilm reader printer in the Society's library archives to make free copies from microfilm, free admission to the Society's 7 historic sites, discounts in the Society's landmark stores at the History Museum, the State Capitol, and Chimney Rock, and reduced fees for kids' classes. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for the financial support which allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television across the state and on the Society's YouTube page. To find that page, just type www.youtube.com/user/Nebraska Historical into your browser search. There are over 130 past brown bags on YouTube. Our speaker today is Mary Ellen Ducey, and the topic is the job of an archivist. Meet a fascinating Nebraskan, Frank Shoemaker. In her position as University Archivist and Special Collections Librarian, she has many opportunities to support research and scholarship relating to the Great Plains. She manages the activities that support access to significant archival collections relating to Willa Cather, Maury Sandoz, and the myriad papers of past faculty and programs associated with the university. She is a Nebraska graduate, having received her BA from NU in 1988. She has a master's in library science from Indiana University, Bloomington, and a Master of History from the University of South Dakota. You may want to check out an article entitled Frank H. Shoemaker, Self-Made Naturalist and Photographer. It was found in the spring 2013 issue of Nebraska History, and it's readily available if you want to read more about Frank Shoemaker. I'll also mention that if you go back to see this on YouTube, we're going to have the reference to this article posted there so you can see it, but I'll have it in the back of the room if you want to look. Just to let you know about asking questions, Mary Ellen says to ask them anytime. Plus, she plans on time at the end for questions. Please join me in welcoming Mary Ellen Ducey.
Well, thank you very much, John. I'm really excited to be here. Was very encouraged by John to make sure I made this talk happen, and so here I am today. I'm glad that you are here today. It's nice to see so many people trickle in as things go on, and I really love Frank Shoemaker. I'm really enthusiastic about him, and sometimes I'll get really so excited I'll be talking fast as a train, so I'll try to keep myself a little calm today. And I'm really happy to have the opportunity to work with the Nebraska State Historical Society. I've got many colleagues in the library and archives, and it's really exciting to kind of be back in the museum after its renovation. There are just a few people that I want to thank that helped me discover Frank Shoemaker and to learn more about him. They include the co-authors of the article that John mentioned, Rebecca Bernthal and Elaine Nowick, and certainly my brother Jim Ducey, whose early interest in bird history led to my own inquiries about Shoemaker's life. And my projects also benefited from a number of students, colleagues, and other very generous individuals, so I really want to thank them. So today my talk will focus on Frank Shoemaker and what we learned about him after working with the records at the Archives and Special Collections at the University of Nebraska State Historical Society. Essentially, I want to know what Shoemaker's story is. Now, I've told a little bit about that story in the article in the Nebraska History magazine. I'll tell a little bit more today, and I know there's a lot more to come. A professor and colleague at the university wrote in 1939 that Frank Shoemaker was, quote, a man of culture, consideration, and ability, keenly interested in many of the fine features of human life and society. So where did this keen interest in life come from? I was fortunate to learn more about Shoemaker and his interests through balancing my role as an archivist and adding in the role of a historian. And in the process, I got to learn more about Shoemaker and Nebraska's environmental history. And so today, what I'm really wanting to do is share some of that story using Shoemaker's own words and his photographs, which are really very distinct. One thing I like about this photograph is that I try to imagine who would have, usually Shoemaker was always behind the camera, so who was behind the camera today for this one? Okay, in an archive, the terms collection, records, papers refer to documents, audiovisual materials, or digital items created by an individual or an organization. It may be items a person collected to document an experience or for research. And generally, archival resources include correspondence, notebooks, photographs, written and edited manuscripts, articles, and newspaper clippings. And these are just a few of the examples of the possibilities of the types of materials you might find in a collection. Oop, let me go the right way. Okay, so a good deal of our work in an archives is arranging and describing materials, and this is what you'll see in this slide here. All of the items I mentioned are found within Shoemaker's records and provided the foundation for his story. His lifelong interest in the natural world resulted in a huge legacy of information in field notes and journals, letters, and thousands of photographs. We figure there's a little over 3,000 photographs. He created what he called narratives, and photographic images saved either as glass plate negatives, lantern slides, or as film negatives. What's interesting for me is that many of these same kind of items that I talk about either in the archive or in Shoemaker's records can be found in our own family records, and things that maybe our grandparents, ourselves, our parents created and were fortunate enough to save. So any of these items and many more can be a story like I'm telling today, but they can also be a family story or history. And we see a lot of use of these types of materials to create genealogical records today. Here is a picture of Shoemaker's original slide, how he originally maintained all of his film in the broken box, and then here the second picture shows how we tried to improve that housing just a little bit and concentrate on long-term preservation of his records. Because the reason for that is that one goal for an archive is to provide access to all of these records and to help preserve them for the next few hundred years. Records and collections show the changes of a history, a person, a town, a city, and community and organizations, and we're really trying to keep that record and allow that to be told. For Frank, the earliest item in his collection was created in the 1890s, well over 100 years ago, and we want that record to be available in the next 100 years too. We need to keep these records around because it's impossible to know what questions we may have and what questions we might ask about these materials and how an archival record might help answer them. This is how many of our collections look after our work on them is completed. They're rehoused, we have described them so people can get access to them, and essentially they're lined up and ready to go. And of course, when we took this picture, I picked the most beautiful looking spot in the whole archive. There are hundreds of collections in the Archives and Special Collections and UNL archives, just as there would be here at the Nebraska State Historical Society. At one point, we measured the linear feet of our collections, and my colleague matched that number to over 52 football fields lined up one after another. And we figured that if once you start talking about linear feet in Nebraska, it's important to mention football. So thinking about all these collections and all these possibilities, questions come to mind. Who created these materials? Who is represented in them? What is significant about them? What can I learn from these things? And again, what is the story? Here's an example I mentioned of a bird list that Shoemaker created after he'd been out working in Omaha, wrote down all of the birds he sighted that day, and then typed them up in a list from his notebook. Probably what Shoemaker is most well known for is his fascination with birds. His bird records served as a basis for research for several Nebraska ornithologists and have been used to discover more about the history of birds in Nebraska. Whenever he traveled throughout the state, on day trips in Omaha and Lincoln, he kept records, and these continued to inform scholarship in that area. Shoemaker really closely explored the natural world that he lived in and documented what he discovered with words and photographs. Everywhere he went, he captured details. From nature, he saved them so he could learn more. He saved them so he could provide them to others. And the result shows his ability to balance creativity with his eagerness to develop his knowledge in any area that he was focused on. Here's another bird list that he typed up from a trip to the Sandhills in 1903. And what's fun about these is you'll see distinct types of birds that would be represented in each area. And then again, we can go back to 1903 if you're a bird enthusiast and say, okay, what birds do we see then? What birds could we see 100 years later? Along with my co-authors, I was interested in learning more about Shoemaker and the resources in his collection. We coordinated our interests and developed a project to digitize Shoemaker's narratives and a selection of his photographs. We didn't know a lot about Shoemaker in the beginning, but we knew that he spent most of his life in Nebraska, and that's why we claim him as a Nebraskan, and we knew about his interest in birds. We took the first step that most researchers in an archival repository take. We looked at the finding aids for Shoemaker, which is a list of everything that's in his collection. The finding aid is a tool that lets you know who created the materials, the date range for the materials from the 1890s to the 1940s for Shoemaker, what was in them, and how many boxes we would have to look through. Sometimes they even contain a list of what's in each folder. This helped us determine what things we really wanted to look at, and so we could make the best use of our time. And that would be true with any researcher who comes into an archive. Here we have a map of one of the narratives that he wrote and created for the Sioux County trip in 1911, and a map that he put in the inside of the first few pages of this story. To discover Shoemaker's story, we started with these narratives, what he called his stories that he combined with his field notes and his photographs. And the most complete set of these are associated with his trips to the Sandhills in 1911. And these narratives, he combined his story with photographs, and the majority of his narratives from any time in his career show that he was interested in telling a story. He could tell a good story, and they always included details related to nature. And they're fascinating, and once you start reading them, you don't want to put them down. Here is a page 8 from the same Sioux County narrative, and Shoemaker is writing about getting supplies from Harriman for the trip, and then he discusses the yucca plants that he shows on the page. The first, I'm going to show you the details here of the yucca plant. This first one is pretty clear and easy to see. Through the process of reading these narratives and in preparing them to put them online through a text encoding standard, I really learned to like Shoemaker. The more I read, the more I wanted to read. The more I read, the more I wanted to share him. His records held a lot of historical information about Nebraska. He could tell a good story, he had a good sense of humor, and he often made me laugh. Along with so many other collections in our repositories, his records are really important. And I will say one of my colleagues is here today, and he could probably attest to the fact that there are times when you're sitting looking at these things and you just have to shout out loud what kind of fun thing you heard that day, and that happened quite often with Frank Shoemaker. Here's a second detail of the yucca in bloom from that page. And it's a little bit more challenging to see than the first one, which was a little bit more clear. And this kind of shows the quality of the original glass plate that Shoemaker made his print from. It could show the chemical challenges that went with creating this print, or it could just show wear over time. Often, Shoemaker would carry his darkroom supplies with them. So instead of coming back to Lincoln or Omaha to create his work, he might be out in the field trying to create pictures and images that day of what he took. So that could be another reason why this may not be ideal in regard to how it looks. On one of his first trips to the Sandhills, Shoemaker and his companions had what he called an uneventful and tiresome journey to Thedford, Nebraska. Shoemaker noted in a 3-page account of the trip that the group slept until about 6 a.m. one day, had a reasonable breakfast before traveling by stage, and he wrote that, quote, "Everything was perfectly new to me, and you may be sure I enjoyed myself very much. I had never seen the sandhills or the yucca and prickly pear or the sand lizards. Something new appeared every minute." This is just one example that shows how they traveled, he and his companions, and how they carried equipment. Most often trains were taken to western Nebraska, and here in this account, the stage is a stagecoach and horses. Cars obviously were still few and far between, but later on in some of his photographs you will see an actual car vehicle. Okay, here I have page 11 of the same narrative, and I want to read a part where Shoemaker is trying to get a good night's sleep, but that's listed on here. In this narrative, he comments on extra guests that showed up one evening, and he writes that, quote, "I did not find time to select a place on the canyon side for my bunk before dark. I worried my way up the slope until I found a fairly level place, cleared away a few stones, and turned in. An interview of questionable duration passed, but I awakened suddenly. In the dark, I shook the ants from my blanket and nightgown, plucked a few skirmishers from my calves and shoulder blades, and selected another site further up. On the whole, it was quite satisfactory and much better than sleeping in a bed. I allude, however, to that portion of the night following the ant episode." Here is a detail of the first photo on that page of Sioux County. This is the Monroe Canyon, and here's looking across Monroe Canyon. And one thing about this image is it's one of several hundreds of images that Shoemaker produced of these beautiful wide open landscapes in Nebraska. Really distinctive and just really lovely. It's hard to pick just a few when you think about putting something like this together. I want to share another one of his stories that really outlines his sense of humor, and it's related to a fishing excursion that took place in the Sioux County trip when he and his group on June 22nd of 1911 went over to Sawbelly Canyon. And these are two images of Sawbelly Canyon, and I'm hoping you're going to indulge me because this quote that I have is a little long, but it's really, really nice. He and his companions, he's got some botanists with him that are focused on plants, and he's got some zoologists with him that are focused on butterflies, and they spent their afternoon after lunch they got busy trout fishing. And he says he must be confessed that the trip to Sawbelly was undertaken for piscatorial reasons first, though we did make our best to make it appear that it was scientific. He continued with a description of the fish and his lure lines, or lures. Let me just get a drink here. Okay, so quote, "These trout were a sore disappointment to me. Far from being educated, they had not the slightest idea of the proper behavior to manifest when a royal coachman was deftly cast on the rippled surface and drawn alluringly across the pond. They lay with heads upstream, lazily waving their tails and wagging their pectoral fins and making eyes at each other. I got much personal gratification out of the handsome casts I made, but no rise, much less a strike, and in truth, it must be said, not even so much as an extra wiggle of a fin. So I remained carefully concealed and changed my fly for a gray hackle, which I cast with consummate grace and skill to the farthest recess of the shady pool, and I drew invitingly over the surface of the tiny ripples. The same rank, unethical disregard was meted out to the gray hackle. So in turn followed the brown hackle, the professor, the white miller, the grizzly kind. Why name the list, since they all met with the same glassy stare and the same lack of consideration? With withering scorn, I plucked me a hale grasshopper from his native reed, impaled him kicking plenty on a cruel bear hook, and cast again,
Business looked up at once, a strike, a fight, a trout, which smelled right fishily and provoked visions of a frying pan and much picking of bones. So Shoemaker had switched from his own flies to grasshoppers, but he says, quote, "It was a day of humility all around. If I was humbled by the forswearing of gentlemen's bait and the adoption of vulgar, goggle-eyed, parasitized, tobacco-spitting grasshoppers, what must have been the feelings of the botanists, who forswore their allegiance to green things and became, for the nonce, most energetic collectors of said grasshoppers? For be it known, Orthopteroides crop was sparse, and it generally took longer to round up a grasshopper than it did to make connections with the trout after the bait was secured. His companions had gathered more grasshoppers for bait. They kept quiet, and they offered congratulations on a good catch. And Shoemaker noted if the trout had been raised with orthodox piscatology, he may have caught the most trout that day. And here is a couple more details of those shots of Sawbelly Canyon. Okay. Any questions so far? Anybody? Okay. Moving beyond the Shoemaker narratives of the Sandhills in 1911, we wanted to learn more about Shoemaker as an individual. While some information came from his narratives, a good deal of information about his life came from letters that he sent to his friends. He would keep copies of some of the letters he sent, and so that gave me an opportunity to read the actual words that he had sent to his friends and work in our story using in his own words. Over time, Shoemaker's story became more clear. For me, though, there were a few interesting diversions along the way. And one of these diversions was some confusion regarding what I called the three Elizabeths. The first and most easily discovered Elizabeth in Shoemaker's life was Elizabeth Van Zandt, who is seen here. Oh, thank you so much, John. I should say that Shoemaker and I also share one trait. We both have hay fever. Okay, so this is Elizabeth Van Zandt, Shoemaker's cousin. The two met in the early 1890s when Shoemaker attended a family reunion in Hampton, Iowa. It appears that a mutual interest in birds started their conversations, and they started to exchange letters. In fact, in his later years, Shoemaker described Elizabeth Van Zandt in a copy of a letter he kept. He said, quote, "My dear cousin EVS, long for Omaha, later Sayre, Oklahoma, and latterly of Sterling, Illinois. I owe more to her for my training and development than to anyone in the world, except my mother." Elizabeth and Shoemaker shared thoughts and adventures. They read the same books and were in tandem in regard to their interests they considered valuable aspects of their lives. And I'm going to talk a little bit that shortly. But it was Elizabeth Van Zandt who mentioned the second Elizabeth in a number of letters. A Miss Elizabeth Weaver resided in the Van Zandt home between 1903 and 1904 before relocating to California. In a 1903 letter that Elizabeth Van Zandt sent to Shoemaker while he was out in Thedford, she said, quote, "Miss Weaver sends her love and says she misses your teasing." Both Elizabeths shared the letters Shoemaker sent from his travels. The final reference came to this Elizabeth was made in a letter from Elizabeth Van Zandt in the 1930s. Adding slightly to the confusion regarding the Elizabeths were letters signed from 1899 to Shoemaker from Kansas City, and one of the letters was signed, "Your mother, Elizabeth," and all of them were addressed to my boy. For a short while, I wondered if a mom, or mother, particularly of her generation, would consider assigning a letter to her son with her first name. However, a quick comparison of signatures proved that these letters actually did come from Elizabeth Van Zandt and not Shoemaker's mother. It made things easier when Shoemaker and Elizabeth Van Zandt started signing their letters with nicknames. Elizabeth eventually started calling Shoemaker with the nickname Prank, and she would sign her letters with the name Quiz. With the clues from the signatures, it became easy to conclude that there were only two Elizabeths and not the three I had outlined at first. And this is just one example of the type of mystery that might appear when you're working with papers and how they can be solved sometimes from the records that you're looking at, and sometimes you may never know, and the mystery is always going to be on the page. Not all of the resources I needed to discover more about Shoemaker were in his collection, and it took some digging to discover more about him. For example, census records provided the complete name of Shoemaker's mother and that he had a sister. The Omaha Western Heritage Center provided more information about the Van Zandt family. and the Nebraska State Historical Society collections were of great help and further highlight the value of the collaboration between our institutions. Probably the most important piece of information that came from the Nebraska State Historical Society was Shoemaker's obituary. We knew the month and day that Shoemaker died, but we found the exact date after looking at the newspaper microfilm here at the Historical Society. I remember how excited I was when I read in the obituary that his estate went into probate. And that might sound really odd, but for me, that meant that perhaps there were more records that I could look at, and there would be more details I could find on Shoemaker. So I was really, really fortunate that there were probate records associated with Frank's estate, and they were available at the Nebraska State Public Records Office. So, here's a woman named Margie Schonfelt here. And one of the more interesting details I located about Shoemaker that was totally unexpected was a connection to Margie Anna Schonfelt, shown here. In a letter that I found later to a pen pal in 1935, Shoemaker stated that he never married. However, one time he did have a fiancée. A will that showed up in Shoemaker's probate records dated February 14th, 1920, lists Margie Ann Schonfelt as his intended wife, but the marriage never took place. Her name appears in a few of Shoemaker's shorter narratives and just a few photographs. It's also interesting to note that Schonfelt shows up in a lot of other university-related records at the Archives and Special Collections because she worked for the Nebraska State Museum about the same time Shoemaker was at the university. And this is a good example of how many people that are significant to our story as a state or as a university show up in different collections that we have, and a lot of things are interconnected and intertwined when it comes to the records at the Archives and Special Collections. But learning about Miss Schonfelt gave a new meaning to one of Shoemaker's narratives called Margie's Garden, which he wrote in 1918 in Lincoln. In 3 pages, he writes about plants that many Nebraska gardeners might recognize, such as hollyhocks, lily of the valley, and iris. And he goes on with a story of his discovery of butterflies behaving disgracefully after they had discovered the sap from an Osage orange tree in the garden. So I'll quote here. Quote, "About 10 of them were lined up at the bar. An indefinite number were engaged in a hilarious air dance through lights and shadows, occasionally pitching to the ground in a stupor where they might be approached and touched without their taking flight. The flyers were so reckless and woozy that some of them bumped into or alighted upon us. Several were sobering up on the neighborhood flowers or leaves with their wings tilted awry, like the inebriate which I had first noticed, and presumably a far greater, undiscoverable number were sleeping it off at home or in jail. It was positively shocking, and such a nice neighborhood and all." I like this one because it was one of Shoemaker's more imaginative and humorous stories that kept me reading. Okay. Here we see a pile of driftwood on Salt Creek, and I believe that the woman on top, if you see her way up in the corner between the trees, is probably Margie Ann Schonfelt. Some of Shoemaker's letters will provide clues about this. One thing that's really important is kind of look at the details in the photograph. Margie has a very distinctive coat that she wears on cold days, and so I can probably confirm that this is Margie based on the coat that she's wearing that day, because it's similar to the one that we saw earlier. So clues like that are really important, kind of helping identify and learn about individuals. Okay, so I've taught a little bit about Shoemaker's life, but we might need to learn a little bit about more Shoemaker before I get back to a part about a little sad part of his story, I guess. So Frank Shoemaker was born in April of 1875 in DeWitt, Clinton County, Iowa. But again, we claim him, just like we claim Willa Cather, as a Nebraskan. His immediate family consisted of his parents, Samuel Henry, and Retura S. Ferries Shoemaker was his mother, and he had one sister, Jessie. According to Shoemaker, in a letter written in 1903, his father worked as a newspaper editor for several Iowa newspapers over the course of his career. And after his father quit working, Shoemaker began to support his family, and that is one of the reasons why he missed his final year in high school. At age 21, Shoemaker moved to Omaha, where he took up residence at the Van Sant home. Elizabeth Van Sant's father, Adam Clark Van Sant, operated a school known as the Van Sant School of Shorthand and Typewriting, and he taught typewriting and created manuals on the Van Sant system of touch typewriting. And Shoemaker worked for them and learned stenography while he was there. His stenography lessons allowed him to get a job for the American District Telegraph Company, and then he later settled at jobs on the railroad and worked for the Harriman Roads, the Oregon Short Line, the Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company, and the Southern Pacific Company. He explained, quote, "I have direct charge of the personal and confidential correspondence of the General Auditor. I shall continue my out-of-door study the same as ever over a larger field, for that to me is the breath of life." In 1909, Shoemaker moved to Lincoln, and here he occasionally took classes at the university, though he never graduated. He did work a lot creating universities, or what we call lantern slides for university departments, and so they could use them to teach in the classroom. It's interesting because when I work with other photo collections in the archives associated with the university, I can immediately recognize when a glass plate negative is Shoemaker's. He had a distinctly signed all of his work with the little FHS in the corner, and he would have worked for the State Museum, for the Botany Department, the Zoology Department, and the Entomology Department, creating photographs. Later on, he worked for the Nebraska State Historical Society, and then after the Depression in the 1930s, he ended up taking a job with the Federal Writers Project in western Nebraska, went out to California for a few years, and then eventually returned to Nebraska, where he lived out the rest of his life. In a 1935 letter to a pen pal in New Zealand, he outlined the basic facts about his life. Quote, "So you can see I'm terribly senior, but I have never acted my age and almost despair of ever growing up. In person, I am 5 feet 7 inches, weigh 146, complexion neither fair nor dark, eyes dark brown, hair almost black, a few gray hairs sneaking in but not yet a quorum. I'm a nature shark, almost every line of natural history, and my photography had made pictorial record of many of my observations and explorations possible. I know I miss something wonderful in family life, but frankly have been too darn interested in too many darn things to worry over it. I have no religion except the Golden Rule. I attend no church, belong to no societies except scientific, have few social contacts beyond the vast number of interesting things which I prefer to bridge, because of the vast interesting things which I prefer to bridge parties." In 1947, Shoemaker underwent surgery for an unknown reason, and as discovered in a letter to Elizabeth Van Sant, when she wrote to inquire about the hospital stay. It appears that this surgery or his lack of recovery may have contributed to his death. He died on January 18th in 1948 at age 72. The obituary notices described him as a widely known naturalist with interest in books and photography and birds. And Elizabeth is listed as his only survivor, but I don't think that she actually came back to Nebraska at the time, and she died 2 years later in California. And this is what I consider to be the most poignant or sad part of the story that I learned from the probate records. The records show that at the time of his death, Shoemaker only had $4.74 cash in his pocket. He had some jobs at the Hobby Collector Service and at the United States Post Office in his last years, and his wages that he got from there and the sale of some of his property, such as a camera and a typewriter and binoculars, were probably used to pay for his burial on an unmarked grave in Wyuka Cemetery here in Lincoln. But despite this seemingly lonely ending, Shoemaker created a significant legacy and one that lives on. This is one of the few photographs that I found of Shoemaker's doing a picture inside a room. And this is the interior room of the Van Sant household. Shoemaker started his interest in birds way back when he was a teenager. He was collecting things. He was out around the family fields looking for birds, looking at species, collecting eggs. And it was a lifelong interest. And here we're in Omaha, and one of the more interesting projects that he and his cousin Elizabeth shared at their Van Sant home, which was at 2926 Dewey Avenue in Omaha, was what they called the bird room. And so this is the entrance to the bird room in the Van Sant home. In a letter, he explained that the room literally went to the birds, as it was easier care for them and more comfortable for 9 birds that they had at the time. He wrote a lengthy letter to his mother about the birds, and he explained that, "I am almost convinced that the birds are diverse as so many people, and I am thoroughly convinced that they are far more interesting subjects for study." In about 9 pages, he describes how Elizabeth and himself enjoyed discovering the unusual distinct behavior of birds, learning their habits, and learning how the birds interacted with each other. And he outlined some of the interesting names they chose for their pets, such as Topsy, Turvy, and Pixie. Here's a couple slides. This is probably taken in the bird room, a set of grosbeaks, and you can see them lined on the back of a basket or on a chair. Here's a second one where you can see a yellow-billed cuckoo, again on the back of the chair, probably in the bird room. And I'm assuming that if I went and looked at some records, I'd probably figure out which one, whether this was Pixie or Topsy or Turvy. Through their involvement in the Nebraska Ornithological Union, or Ornithologist Union, Shoemaker and Elizabeth met many people both from Omaha and Lincoln and surrounding communities with the same interest in birds. The NOU held its first meeting in July 1899, and 4 years later, Shoemaker served as its president. It's really nice to note that many of the NOU members that he met this way were his friends and colleagues throughout his life. And this again shows how these NOU records, university records, and the larger community are again represented in the archives at UNL. And next up I have multiple selections of birds and birds' nests here. And I kind of like these because it shows the effort Shoemaker took to be able to take a picture and how challenging it was, especially when we think of how fast we can take a picture today as compared to what he could do then. He took a lot of out in the Sandhills among the different lakes that are out there in that region. He would take a lot of different birds and birds' nests. So this is Hackberry Lake in Cherry County. This is one of my favorite series. Occasionally he would talk about having to pose birds to get a good picture if he could do it. So I'm thinking this is where he took these young screech owls and tried to get them to pose for a picture and actually placed them on this branch to do it. And you could see that here no one's looking at the camera for him right now. And then here's a couple looking at the camera, but they can't stay still. And finally, he gets a good picture. And then we have another set of the same kind of effort. Here we have two Cooper's hawks near Roca, Nebraska. And this is good, interesting to look at because again, it's going to show a little bit of wear and tear on the negative that happens over time. So if this was taken in 1913, we're talking 100 years ago, it could have been the quality of the backing of the slide on the glass plate negative that kind of had some damage over time. And that could have been based on how he had to produce the actual negative or how it was housed. We try to make sure that we maintain good temperature and humidity in the archives and special collections to kind of mitigate some of this nowadays. But here are the same two young hawks looking just a little bit different. Okay, here we have a nest in Child's Point in Sarpy County. This one I really love. We're looking at some nests, and again in Child's Point near Sarpy County, which is an area sort of near Bellevue. But I can't decide exactly what angle he's using to get at this photo, but I like to think that he climbed the tree and was looking down, and so he had to carry his camera and his negatives up the tree, look down, and find that nest, which is kind of fun. And then here is one, something that we could still recreate today. So, it's not something that some of his photography is something we might not be able to do, but many of it, if we have the same kind of interest, we could also recreate. Okay. So, I talked about earlier about how probably his most important legacy are these photographs and these pictures that we're seeing today. He captures landscapes all across Nebraska that have changed and altered and we really wouldn't see in the same way today. He did beetles, birds, and anything related to his travel, anything related to the natural world. Here is a Townsendia plant in Sioux County, Nebraska. What's going on with this plant today? Has its range increased? Is it still abundant out there? These are some of the questions we might be able to ask from his bird or pictures. Here's another kind of vista from West Monroe County. Shoemaker's interest in photography helped him to observe the natural world as it existed, and he got to keep a collection and report on the sightings of rare plants or animals without having to harm the observed species. And that's a real distinction he learned early on. Let's not grab everything and bring it home. Let's take pictures and bring those pictures home. Here's a picture of the Badlands area near Monroe Creek, and then a close-up. Now, I don't know exactly what camera he was using at the time, but how did he get in to get that close-up? I'm not quite sure. According to several letters that he wrote, he bought his first camera in 1898 when he moved to Omaha, and he shared the camera and the cost with Elizabeth Van Zandt. And they had 4 cameras at the time, but then they bought one that they liked the best and used that exclusively. And as a result of this interest in photography, he says that, quote, Elizabeth and I have about 450 glass plate negatives on the subject receives all of our attention. It is to the photographing or photographing of natural history subjects, pure and simple, that we devote ourselves. And when we get out of line, we are filled with joy to get back again. This is one of my favorite pictures just because it seems like such a dynamic photograph in the way it looks. He says also, he told a friend that many of his pictures could not be duplicated, quote, owing to the chance of time and circumstance. This is a unique photo that may never be recreated in again. Here is a picture across Clear Lake, Iowa, and many of his records give us more details on the makeup and diversity of lakes out in that area. The camera was with Shoemaker throughout his life. He carried it all the time. In the early days when he was working with glass plate negatives, he had to carry a set of glass plate negatives to capture his images. And before he had film, which was a little easier to carry, he'd have to figure out how many glass plates he would take with him for an adventure or on a day. So he had only a few that he could use that day. He might say, okay, I can use 10 at Clear Lake because I might be walking home and see something else I need to take. So it was really always a challenge for him. And it's very different for us when we can think about, putting up our little digital cameras and just snapping away. What we've done at the Archives and Special Collections is to capture these negatives as TIFF files, which is a high-quality format, and a long-term preservation is what we'll do in the archives, and then we'll make them accessible through the JPEG format, which we most often seen in our cameras and our camera phones and phones today. Okay, so now I'm going to move it back closer to home. Here is a picture of the snow on the gym building here at the University of Nebraska campus. You can see how interesting it is that he's just looked up and saw that snow falling off the building. We have a lot of these pictures of the university campus, and that's really just a great resource for us. Here's another picture of the library when it was in Architecture Hall. I like looking at this because the gardens were very unique at the time, and I think in front we see a lot of cannas that were being planted and ready to bloom. This one I picked out today, lilac at Judge Tuttle's home, because this is a huge, gigantic lilac bush, and I'm hoping all of us have had the opportunity to go past a lilac bush in the last few days and just have a lovely, delicious smell run past our noses for that. And here finally, here is the original state capitol in Lincoln before our current state capitol was built. Again, it kind of makes a good connection between some of our resources here because all of these photographs of the state capitol now reside in the state capitol collections in the basement of the state capitol. One of the really important things that Shoemaker also did was he kept information about his photographs. So he would give it a number, he would give it a date, he would give it a location, so we know a lot about what was going on here. So we've got a lot of detail, and it does a great deal for research when you have that information. Some of this information is not readily available, but what we do is if we hope is we get more of this stuff up online, we might find that people in the audience or people who come across the photo either in our reading room or in an online environment might provide for more information. These pictures I brought up because the pictures around the cottonwoods and plants around Salt Creek in Nebraska, he really, really liked because this picture, I think in particular, was one of his favorites because he took it, he printed it, he hand colored it, and then sold it for prints over the course of one Christmas season. So, and they're really beautiful, and again, shows some of the creativity he had when it came to working with his photographs. And actually, I think looking at how much Shoemaker tried to document his materials, provide information, provide all these details, is kind of a cautionary tale for us, because with our digital cameras, we just generate several hundred photographs in a year. We might generate in a year the number of photographs that Shoemaker created throughout the course of his life. And so it's really hard to know how we keep information about these photos together, and how much we're going to keep together, and how much we're going to have for the next 100 years. And this is going to be a real challenge for archival repositories. And I'm kind of happy that I'm on the longer end of that maybe I can stick to paper for a while before I have to think about that challenge. Okay, the final really thing I want to talk about today about Shoemaker is that one that really ties closely with Lincoln. In the early 1900s, he was always focused on birds, always focused on photography, but suddenly his interest shifted to tiger beetles. And this is Frank Shoemaker chasing tiger beetles at Salt Creek. In fact, he received a letter from a friend in 1904 that said, quote, "Do not for a day fail to remember that in August you are coming down to Lincoln to work over the tiger beetles with me when I put my paper on tiger beetles of Nebraska in shape. And do not fail to gather a goodly number wherever you have the opportunity." Now, certainly we wouldn't condone people gathering tiger beetles anymore today, but that's what described today. So we have Shoemaker as a self-described photographer, a self-described ornithologist, and now we have him as a self-described entomologist. And in fact, he wrote to a friend in 1905 that he, quote, described himself as entirely daft on the subject of tiger beetles. And as proof, he wrote up a little story that he called Tiger Hunting in the Jungles of the United States. And I'll just read a little bit of that. He starts out in the first paragraph, quote, "Thinking of hunting tigers without the necessity of drawing all one's savings from the bank or taking 6 months away from the office. It can be done, for there are tigers probably prowling about most any place one roams or any time one has half a day off. The fact that these tigers are rather small is offset by the great number of them to be captured, there being 149 varieties. All of these claim the beautiful family name of Cincindelidae, or tiger beetles for short." There's no date on this story, but it goes on to describe the best place and best time of day to capture beetles. And again, we probably wouldn't say no capturing, but he did then, and he shared his beetles and his collections with faculty at the University of Nebraska, and many of the specimens that he did collect at the time of the Coleoptera are still in the collections of the Nebraska State Museum. Here we come back briefly to Margie Schonfelt, who was out tiger hunting with Shoemaker at one point. And then here is a close-up, and this is really hard to see, but I bet if you're a tiger beetle expert, you look at that and you know exactly what you're looking at. But these are tunnels made by tiger beetles out in the same area in the Salt Creek where they are found. And again, this is a little dicey, but here are specimens that actually Shoemaker found. And again, this is not something we would do at all today. So beyond what I've talked about in words and photographs, one of Shoemaker's biggest legacies is that we can go out and experience his breath of life and see some of these areas with tiger beetles at the Shoemaker Marsh in the north part of Lincoln, Nebraska. The marsh was named after him. In an article published in the Lincoln Journal-Star, there's a article titled "Lincoln's Little-Known Frank Shoemaker Marsh is a Naturalist's Dream Come True." And I know that Shoemaker would have thought this was a dream come true and be very honored to have his name on the marsh. About 2 years after that was named, a news release came from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service that announced the designation of the tiger beetle as a federally endangered species. And now, just about 10 years later, more articles from the Lincoln Journal-Star stated that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service recovery plan for saving the tiger beetle is outlined to take almost 30 years and cost about $30 million. And why it's going to save our tiger beetle, it's going to work on saving some of the saline wetlands that are around this marsh area that Shoemaker has outlined and shown in his photographs. So we can really see with the marsh and this obsession with tiger beetles and the designation for the tiger beetle as a endangered species show that Shoemaker's work really has impact in many ways still today. And his impact and his joy and his passion for all these things is really valuable the span of the last 100 years. Hopefully you can see way up there he's got a little marker on these stones that says, "Study nature, not books." But I know that Shoemaker did both. He studied nature and books. And he had a real sense of humor, a real sense of beauty. And while I've been able to discover part of the stories, there's still a lot more to discover about him, about the state's environmental history, and the people and landscapes that show up in his pictures. And I hope to continue to learn about that. And I've got plans for other things to do with Shoemaker's life, his close friends, and learn more about his story as it continues. So that's my talk about Frank Shoemaker, and I'd certainly love to answer any questions that you may have about anything I talked about or anything that you've seen today. Are there any questions for me today? Yes? How are Frank Shoemaker's trips funded? The majority of his work was funded out of his own pocket. I believe that the 1911 trips to the Sioux County, Cherry County, Thedford, Thomas, and Banner County were part of a field trip, summer field trip out of the University of Nebraska Botany Department. So the Botany Department probably had funding in that time and hired him to come out and take pictures and feed them with trout. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you know what happened with him and Margie?
In March? No, and that's an interesting question that I have not just yet discovered. Oh, I'm sorry. What is the end story of Margie Schonfelt and Frank Shoemaker and their relationship? I do not know what has happened. The only thing I know about Margie is that she probably learned some photography skills from Shoemaker because she did a lot of photography work for the State Museum. I haven't seen anything in his letters that talks about that. I'd like to think that something else will appear about Margie, but I have not known anything yet. So it's kind of a mystery. Another question over here somewhere? Yes?
Is this like the university, how are you coming on getting your photographs online? How can they be accessed?
Okay. Well, thankfully, this is a lovely story for me. I had a gentleman who was aware of, okay, thank you, I'm getting this. How am I getting these photographs out there into the world and making them available to be seen? At this time, I have a website on Frank Shoemaker, and I have all of the complete transcripts of his Sioux County and Sandhills narratives from 1911 online. And so those are already available online. We're working on putting a gallery of his photos up online, and that has just been, initial stages have started on that. I received some really generous funding from an anonymous donor that's allowing me to revamp a website that will really enhance access. And so slowly we're scanning, we're getting the details together and putting that stuff up online so that people can see them, can use them. And then we have many other botanists and zoologists who also took photos, and we'll continue to add to that until what I hope to be this huge, gigantic gallery of fantastic photos that will wow people when they think about the history of the state. That's my plan. Any other questions? Yes.
Are his samples still around? I mean, I know you have the photographs now, but what about the beetles and his collections and his specimens? Are those?
Yeah, the beetles I showed, they will still have those specimens at the samples and materials that he still has on campus that were not photographs show up in the State of Nebraska Museum. So if you want to see some of the actual beetles that he would have collected on his excursions, you could see them at the State Museum. I'm not sure what other specimens specifically he may have captured, but of the beetles, I know they're there. Yes. Any other questions? Well, thank you. Thank you so very much for being here today and letting me talk about this and letting me share Shoemaker's story. If there's anything else you want to learn about him or about the archives and special collections at UNL, I'm happy to talk more about that. So thank you so much for being here today.